Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are connecting from. My name is Caroline Moreau. I am a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And as the Director of Research of the William Gates Institute, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a two-part webinar where we will be discussing the Institute's research agenda around conceptualizing, measuring, and advancing women's autonomy and agency. So today we will focus our investigation on the foundations for measuring women's empowerment across two core dimensions of empowerment: economic empowerment and sexual and reproductive health empowerment. So after a brief introduction, I will be joined by three esteemed colleagues who will share their insights on a measurement of these two dimensions. And we'll start with Dr. Elizabeth Omoluwabi, who is the founder and executive director of Akena Group, which operates both in Nigeria and Senegal. She's also senior researcher at the Western Cape University. Liz is a demographer by training, and she has extensive experience in leading very large-scale population-based surveys across Africa, including the performance monitoring for action in Nigeria, from which a lot of the results we will be sharing throughout these two seminars are drawn. Liz will share her experience in developing a cross-cultural measure of women's sexual and reproductive health empowerment using an EMIC approach. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Celia Karp. Celia is an assistant professor at Hopkins, and her research lies at the intersection of psychosocial determinants of reproductive health, such as pregnancy preferences and empowerment, as well as systems approaches, including quality of healthcare provision. She's been instrumental in developing the Women and Girls Sexual Reproductive Health Index we will be talking about, and she'll present its psychometric properties as well as its application in global settings. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Carolina Cordona. She is a assistant scientist at Hopkins. She is trained as a health economist, and her work is at the intersection of economic demography and health. She's particularly interested in the influence of fertility and mortality on population dynamics and economic growth. And she's going to pivot the conversation and talk about measurement of economic empowerment from a cross-country index perspective. So just to start this conversation, our work is situated within a global conversation around the position of women's empowerment, not only as a means for advancing global development, but also as a rights-based approach and end in itself. And while this concept is well recognized, its empirical application has some limitations. And this is partly because existing measures or indicators lack conceptual grounding or cross-country validation. And so this hinders both our ability to monitor progress in women's empowerment, as well as the ability to demonstrate the role of empowerment on health and well-being. So at the Gates Institute, we sought to address some of these concerns, starting with a fundamental question about what is empowerment and how do we measure it? And this will be the focus of our conversation today. And then building on these constructs, next week we will be talking about what are the drivers of empowerment. In other words, who's empowered and why empowerment matters for reproductive health outcomes. Before I get into the specifics of the frameworks that guide our work, I'd like to extend a special acknowledgement to our former director, Dr. Amy Choi, who championed this work and initiated this work. And I also would like to acknowledge the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that supported much of the research we will be presenting today. So there has been a lot of progress in the field of conceptualizing empowerment, and there are different frameworks that, while have different details attached to them, also share common principles, which acknowledge the role of choice and decision-making as vital to empowerment, as well as the concept of empowerment as both a process and an outcome. We also recognize empowerment touches on many aspects of the spheres of life, and therefore is multidimensional, and importantly is not a state, but rather a dynamic process that unfolds over the life course. So in this work that we will present, and especially the work around sexual and reproductive empowerment, we chose to ground our work on Kabir's framework that acknowledges empowerment at the interplay between agency, which is the ability to set goals and act on them, with the resources such as the structural, social, or economic enablers that support empowerment. What is appealing in this framework is it sets a stage process with empowerment starting with the existence of choice or the ability to set goals that are aligned with one's value, and then moves to exercise of choice, which is the ability to act on one's goal, and ultimately lands on achievement of choice, which in the area of sexual and reproductive health can be framed as sex by choice, contraceptive by choice, or pregnancy by choice. We have a packed agenda today, and so please use the Q&A if you can to post your questions, and we'll do our best to respond as we go. And now I will pass the baton to Liz, who will talk about an emic approach to developing a cross-cultural measure of women's sexual and reproductive empowerment. Liz, the floor is yours.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And Caroline, thank you very much for inviting me to join this work. And I'm really glad to be here to share our experience in this very, very exciting work that involved both Nigeria and several other countries. So basically, in research with some of these complex concepts like empowerment, we tend to have references from other countries that we try to apply in our own countries. I'm talking about, developing countries compared with to developed countries. And so that kind of collaboration, we were very lucky with the PMA project that we had a group and we were able to try to look from an insider point of view, those of us from developing countries, to say, let us see from a bottoms-up approach, let us see from an insider point of view how some of these concepts play out. How do we define empowerment? What do we recognize as empowerment? And how is it different from the eyes of our community? So that instead of looking at an ethic kind of approach where we are looking at concepts that come from other cultures, let us see how we define some of these concepts. How do we understand them, and what is empowerment? How do we express empowerment? How can somebody who is not from our culture recognize that somebody might be empowered? So we tried to use this emic approach to study empowerment. Next slide. So, as I said, this was a multi-country study. And so we had Nigerians, Ethiopians, and Ugandans. So with various sites in each of these countries. So in Nigeria, we had a site in Anambra State and in Kano State. In Ethiopia, Amhara region, whereas in Uganda, we had 2 districts that were studied, from which we collected data. Next slide. So what I'm going to talk about is the qualitative research aspect of our work. So we did conduct qualitative research in these 3 countries and developed all the instruments and the tools that we implemented in these countries, and that led to the development of the scales for validation that were used in the quantitative. But in the next slides, I will just give you a few snippets of the results. But basically, we conducted in-depth interviews, about 120 in-depth interviews, 38 focus group discussions, and we tried to talk with women, with men. We looked at urban and rural areas, and through deductive coding, tried to reflect the conceptual framework, and then tried to identify thematic areas coming out of the work. And as a group, both in country and outside, we tried to do a kind of cross-country code book with country-specific codes, so that we were able to bring in ideas from the different, all the different segments of our populations. Quick results. Some of the results are very interesting. Sorry, I see somebody asking for translation. C'est dommage, désolé, il n'y a pas de traduction cette fois-ci, but we will think about that for next time. So yes, in terms of some of the results, it's very interesting. So remember that we are talking about whether there's existence of choice, exercise of choice, and achievement of choice. And how do we see that in the different cultures that constituted this study? So what we found out in many of these studies, in many of much of the data, was that sex is mostly thought of as a marital obligation. I remember in my early studies, when I asked a question about, this regular question in demography, how many times have you had sex in the past 1 week? Someone responded and said, is it pounded yam? The Nigerians might understand what I mean, that, what's the big deal, And so the idea of choice around sex, for some people, it was, what are you talking about? For me, there's no choice. There's nothing like choice. It's either you want it or I want it. But the idea that you could say you had a choice in the matter was something more or less alien. You are taught to be a good spouse or to be a good husband, and you are taught to, in a couple is set up to make children, and a pleasure is something else. Extramarital sex is a wasteful exercise in some of these cultures, and is generally acceptable for men, even though it's not really encouraged. It's more acceptable for men than for women. So that's like around the existence of choice. In terms of exercise of choice, that's where it's very interesting, and I feel that some of our input into this type of research is to realize that communication, the way it is understood in some of the literature as empowerment, that communication doesn't need to be verbal. There are a lot of non-verbal tactics that women or men would use to negotiate sex. And so the fact that you are not verbally communicating this does not necessarily mean that you are not empowered to exercise choice around sex. So you have a quote here that says, "I keep silent even if I have sexual desire, since I am afraid of him. We live in different places, so if I express my sexual feeling, he might suspect that I could have sex with somebody else." Or a woman may want to show a man that she wants to have sex, and she will dress sexy so that she will entice him and so on. She doesn't necessarily have to say it. So if you were reading about spousal communication and you see that there's no communication, that does not mean that there is no exercise of choice. And if she doesn't want to have sex, she might pretend that she's menstruating, or she might wear restrictive clothing or something. So all of this to say there is a whole world out there of nonverbal cues around negotiating sex. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the existence of choice, I want to kind of leave you with a quote that I like very much in this work that says, where's that one? No, I think there's the one about I am the key. So I think it's in the next slide. Yes, okay, that's the exercise of choice around contraception. Yes, I am the master key that opens and locks, so I decide what to do. This is a woman in Uganda saying she doesn't have to talk about this, but she has the control over her choice to use or not to use contraception. If you tell me to use family planning, yet I am not interested, I can easily lie to you that I received injection and end up being pregnant. Or if you don't want me to use contraception, I can go ahead and get an injectable and you wouldn't know. So at the end of the day, women have power to decide whether or not to use contraception, and they don't have to talk about it, and they could use contraception covertly, and that is empowerment. So I will stop here and pass on the mic to Celia to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liz. Just confirming you can hear me. Great. Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Liz and Caroline, for getting us started today and providing a lot of the really important background and foundation to kind of frame the conversation today as we think about how the measurement work from the Gates Institute related to sexual and reproductive health empowerment has really evolved from this qualitative work that Liz was describing. So in this section of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the measures we have related to contraceptive and sexual empowerment, and just provide a little bit of insight into how we moved from that qualitative work into these quantitative measures. So as you can see kind of depicted on this slide, and based on the discussion that Liz provided about the kind of key findings related to existence of choice and exercise of choice for both contraception and sex. We leveraged those qualitative interviews and conducted extensive qualitative analyses, which have been published in some of the papers that are referenced on the bottom of this slide. But we took those findings and collectively, as a multi-country team, developed an initial item pool, which was in the beginning much more than 51 draft items related to sexual and reproductive health empowerment. But eventually we kind of dwindled it down to that number in order to have a range of items that reflected the key themes that we saw arising related to existence of choice for sexual empowerment and contraceptive empowerment, as well as empowerment in pregnancy to become pregnant by choice, but ultimately that didn't result in a scale. So today we're really focused on the contraceptive empowerment and sexual empowerment pieces. But to develop this initial set of draft items focused on measuring what we conceptualized and based on the qualitative findings was the existence of choice, whether or not women perceived that that choice existed for them related to sexual interactions as well as contraceptive use. We also developed draft items to reflect the area of exercise of choice, whether or not people could act on those their preferences related to sex and contraception in order to achieve their choices. And again, this is all falling in alignment with the with the framework that Caroline presented, showing kind of the evolution from existence of choice through exercise of choice to achievement of choice. On this slide, you see just a few examples of some of the initial 51 draft items related to sexual empowerment. So we had some items such as, if I refuse sex with my husband or partner, I fear he may seek sex from another partner. I'm confident I can tell my husband or partner when I want to have sex, or anytime my husband or partner wants to have sex, I must give it to him. And for sexual empowerment, we had items such as, if I use family planning, people will think I am managing my life wisely. I can choose what to do about family planning, regardless of what my husband or partner tells me to do. And if my husband or partner found out that I was using family planning, he would force me to stop using it. So individuals responded to each of these items based on a Likert scale response, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The scoring for those ranged from 1 to 5. And again, these were the draft items. These were not the final set of items. Next slide, please. For more information about those specific, the initial 51 items, you can see the Moreau et al. Paper reference here and find that list. So to evaluate these 51 draft items, there was a two-phase approach that we used. In phase 1, we conducted pilot testing of those 51 items in 4 sites among more than 1,200 women aged 15 to 49. And we conducted psychometric analyses to explore and identify these cross-site constructs, so constructs that were arising across the 4 geographies where we conducted the analysis. And then we used logistic regression to assess the construct validity of each dimension. So analyses identified subscales that were in alignment with our conceptual framework for sexual existence of choice and contraceptive existence of choice. And then we also looked at the internal reliability of those measures. And at that stage of the analysis, we were able to take the 51 items and reduce them down to an item set that we ended up taking on with us to phase 2, which is the scale up that's listed here on the slide. So in phase 2, which was conducted much more recently, we leveraged data from the Performance Monitoring for Action survey, which I will talk about in just a minute. But we leveraged data to conduct a validation of the women's and girls' empowerment and sexual and reproductive health items, which comprised 14 items total, 6 items for sex and 8 items for contraception, which we'll see shortly. And we conducted this validation exercise in 7 countries and 9 geographies using representative surveys that collectively included more than 24,000 women. And we conducted confirmatory factor analysis per site and by sexual and reproductive health outcome. Next slide, please. So how and where were these data collected? I think Liz briefly mentioned this about how this entire project and through all of its different stages was operating through the Performance Monitoring for Action, or PMA, survey platform, and that included the qualitative work that preceded this quantitative stage. But the PMA project was operating in 8 countries and 10 sites. and there were representative samples of women of reproductive age or age 15 to 49. And the PMA platform used a resident enumerator design in which individuals from the communities where the data were being collected were the ones to field the surveys. So this is how the data that were used in the phase 2 or validation piece of this project were collected. Next slide, please. Oh, and I should briefly mention, sorry, from the last slide, we had a nice little map on there. So the 8 countries included Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, DRC, Rajasthan State in India, Kenya, Niger, Nigeria, and Uganda. And the data were nationally representative in all geographies except in DRC, India, and Nigeria, where those data were regionally representative. Thank you for moving backwards. Okay, back to the items themselves. So as I mentioned, we validated the items for sexual empowerment and contraceptive empowerment separately. All of the processes and results related to sexual empowerment are published in this Wood et al. Paper that is referenced at the bottom, and the ones for contraceptive empowerment are outlined in the Karp et al. Paper referenced at the bottom. So for the sexual empowerment measure that we reduced down to, we had 6 items, 3 items reflecting existence of choice, and 3 items reflecting exercise of choice. And you can see for both sex and contraception, the items for existence of choice are reflected in these green shading, and those for exercise of choice are in the purple. So there were the 6 items for sexual empowerment, and then 8 items that were tested for contraceptive empowerment. And in the initial reduction of the contraceptive empowerment measure, there was a 9th item, which is very similar to another one of the exercise of choice items that you can see flagged at the bottom of the slide. But unfortunately, it was excluded from the surveys that we fielded through PMA due to a survey error, but we ultimately ended up just retaining the 8 items that you see listed on this slide for contraceptive empowerment. So next slide. So we took these items, and these figures here are presenting an example pulled from Burkina Faso. That's reflecting the confirmatory factor analysis or structural equation modeling that we used for both sexual empowerment and contraceptive empowerment. But what we did was we took the data that was collected at that population-based sampling or the population-based surveys, either nationally representative or regionally representative in the 7 countries that I mentioned. And we ran separate models per empowerment dimension. So contraceptive empowerment, which is reflected on the right-hand side of the slide, and sexual empowerment. And we ran these models both by the sexual and reproductive health outcome, as well as by site. So we didn't just pool the 24,000 women across geographies because as we briefly discussed from the qualitative, we really acknowledge that there is a lot of site-specific variation in how these processes play out in women's lives. So we really maintained the site-specific analyses and ran analyses for sexual empowerment by each site, as well as for contraceptive empowerment by each site. The confirmatory factor analysis used a 2-factor model to account for the 2 domains. Again, paralleling that conceptual framework that Caroline introduced, but to really reflect the 2 domains of exercise of choice and of existence of choice and exercise of choice as interrelated but distinct components of the empowerment process. And we wanted to make sure that that was reflected in our modeling approach to see if that factor structure was still maintained in the analyses. Next slide, please. So this is just briefly showing internal consistency reliability or Cronbach's alpha values across geographies. And generally, we found that for this combined measure of sexual empowerment and a combined measure of contraceptive empowerment, And when I say combined, I mean this is a measure that comprises both existence and exercise of choice for each sexual and reproductive health outcome. We found that internal consistency reliability was generally acceptable across geographies, and on the whole, it was slightly higher for contraceptive empowerment than for sexual empowerment. And again, this was going from that 51 initial items down to a reduced set of items that held across geographies, but running these site-specific models to see how that retained set of scale items for measuring sexual empowerment or contraceptive empowerment played out across context. We also see here that there was lowest internal consistency reliability for sexual empowerment in Congo Central, and for contraceptive empowerment that was observed in Kinshasa. So we see some things kind of playing out in DRC in terms of how these items and measures are operating in relation to maybe the measures being a bit stronger in other contexts. So thank you. Next slide. So this is an example. The items listed on the left of the slide in that table, those are just the sexual empowerment items that you saw earlier. And in this slide, I'm just walking through how to calculate the women's and girls' empowerment and sexual and reproductive health scores, so that if this is a measure that you'd like to use in your surveys, you can follow this process in order to have the measure that parallels these measures that were validated. So essentially the first step is inverse coding negatively worded items so that there's consistency across the score or across the items, so that a higher score consistently reflects greater empowerment. The second step then takes the average of items separately by empowerment domain. So what that means is you're taking the average of individuals' scores or responses to each of the existence of choice measures and doing the same thing for the exercise of choice measures. And then in the third step, you're taking the average of their existence of choice and their exercise of choice score to come up with what an individual's overall sexual empowerment or contraceptive empowerment score is based on the average of their existence and exercise of choice responses. And that's really because we, in this process, we're equally weighting an individual's existence and exercise of choice as critical components to the empowerment process. And while there's an equal number of items for the sexual empowerment measure, the contraceptive empowerment measure has a greater number of items for existence of choice. So we wanted to make sure that in the final calculation for their overall contraceptive empowerment score, it equally balances the existence and exercise of choice to play into that empowerment level and process. All right, so moving on to sexual versus contraceptive empowerment. This is showing data for just only the nationally representative geographies presented. So you see a fewer number of geographies in the graphs on the right-hand side of the slide. But this is just showing individuals' contraceptive empowerment scores, sexual empowerment scores, and then an overall SRH empowerment score that accounts for both contraceptive empowerment and sexual empowerment, again, taking the average of those two health domains. So overall, empowerment scores for both dimensions, we saw that, as you can see on the graph here, were lowest in Niger and kind of consistently highest in Kenya. So you can see that indicated Niger in the top right. Sorry, I can't point on the screen. And Kenya in the lower left-hand side. For sexual empowerment, we saw that individual scores on a range of 1 to 5 ranged from, on average, the lowest of 3.35 to 3.98. So a tighter range in score there. And for contraceptive empowerment, we saw that this ranged from 3.68 to 4.24. And again, the higher end of that is really represented in Kenya, as you can see on the slide. We also saw some patterns such that contraceptive empowerment was rather consistently higher than sexual empowerment, though there were some differences across geographies. We saw that the greatest difference was observed in Burkina Faso with a 0.55 point difference between contraceptive and sexual empowerment. And that's maybe indicating something about the differences in the ways that women can express and exercise their reproductive preferences and choices related to contraception versus sex in this geography. And then we saw the smallest difference in Cote d'Ivoire, which was only by 0.18 points, again, comparing on average individuals' contraceptive empowerment score to their sexual empowerment score. So this is just a glimpse into kind of what we're seeing when we take these measures of contraceptive empowerment, sexual empowerment, and then a combined measure of SRH empowerment that is for both contraception and sex. And we look specifically by geography and then across geographies to see how the measure is playing out. So to wrap up this section of the presentation before handing it over to Carolina, just some key takeaways of these validated measures of sexual and reproductive health empowerment. The use of the WGE SRH index really emphasizes how empowerment varies widely across regions, across these countries where we were able to conduct the analysis. But the tool provides a means that can be used to kind of track empowerment and progress on in improving empowerment to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 5, which Caroline mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. So the contraceptive empowerment, sexual empowerment, and SRH empowerment variations of this WGE SRH index may be a useful tool that can be adopted and can be integrated into surveys that are being conducted at various levels in order to track empowerment progress over time and see how there are changes happening even related to the specific health domains of contraception versus sex versus the overall score. And we also see, as I highlighted in that last slide, that empowerment varies across these SRH domains. And this is not a surprise, but it's interesting to see it, play out so strongly in these results. That there are big differences in the ways that contraceptive empowerment and sexual empowerment are expressed and how those processes evolve in different geographies. And the WGE SRH index and its submeasures can be a useful tool, again, for kind of identifying mechanisms of change that may be useful for informing programs, for example, related to family planning or enhancing individuals' exercise of choice to act on their contraceptive preferences, for example. So the individual items as well as the measures as a whole can be useful in these two ways. And we really hope that this provided just, a glimpse of kind of what the process was for developing these measures and for most recently validating them. And we will share the references on the last slide of this presentation in case you're interested in learning more. So with that, I will hand it over to Carolina to walk us through recent developments in economic empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. Just checking if you can hear me well.
Yep.
Perfect. Thanks, Celia. That was a great presentation, and thanks, Caroline and Liz. I'm Carolina Cardona, and today I'm going to be presenting some of the ongoing work that we've been doing at the Gates Institute on Women's Economic Empowerment. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing on the results from our cross-country index. Next one, please. Thank you. I'm not going to start by explaining why we care about economics empowerment, because Caroline already did an excellent job introducing the framework. But I do want to spend some time by introducing some of the metrics that have been developed to measure women's economic empowerment. One of the most widely known metrics, and I've seen that some people have also in this survey, there are 3 questions that are asked in the female questionnaire in which they ask women to report who makes the decisions in the household about their own healthcare, about the purchases of large household items, and the visits to family and relatives. These questions were developed in the early 2000s and were developed by an advisory group following Sunita Kishore's framework, in which it aims to measure women's control over several aspects of their lives and environments. This questionnaire was limited to collect empowerment data that is relevant at the household level, given that the DHS is a household questionnaire. Other tools that are out there that have been developed mainly to monitor and evaluate interventions in which women's economic empowerment is perceived as the outcome of interest are listed in this slide in the next bullet points. The first one, developed by the United Nations Foundation, in which they measure 14 different dimensions of economic empowerment, implementing 32 survey questions. Then we have the one developed by Ipsos, in which they have 49 survey questions to measure 3 different dimensions of economic empowerment. We also have the Growth and Economic Opportunities for Women, or GROW, developed by the International Development Research Center, in which they capture 16 different dimensions of economic empowerment by asking 81 survey questions. And finally, we have the Work and Opportunities for Women, or WOW, that has been developed by the Department of International Development of the UK, in which they capture 5 different dimensions, or 48 by asking 48 survey questions. Now, all of these metrics are doing a great job at capturing economic empowerment, but the caveat here, or the gap that we intended to fill with our research, is that none of these have been gone through a validation process in which we can attest that they have a cross-country validity, meaning that they can capture the different nuances that could be playing different cultural roles across countries. And this is the gap that we filled with our work, and we wanted to validate whether we could find a metric that measures women's economic empowerment that has a cross-country validity. So in the next one, in order to do this cross-country validity, we had to leverage a data set that had been collecting data with following the same survey design, because we wanted to be able to compare countries. So we leveraged the data that has been collected by the Performance Monitoring for Action project, which is also the data set that has been used by my colleagues in the prior presentations. For this specific economic empowerment, we had data available across 7 countries, which were equivalent to 9 sites, given that in 2 countries we're not nationally representative, but we have a regional representation. For this validation exercise of economic empowerment, we utilized data that were collected in the cross-sectional design of PMA, collecting data in the year 2019 and 2020. I'm not going to spend time going through the methodological steps because Celia already did a great job explaining those. We did follow a similar step approach, the similar steps to validate our metric. Just to inform that the way that we started our validation for economic empowerment was with 10 survey questions. Next one, please. These are the 2 domains that we started in our survey that we intended to measure with our PMA survey. The first domain was looking at measuring women's household decision-making power, through which we ask women to report who usually makes the decisions in their household about the purchasing of large items of daily necessities, of medical care, and of clothes for herself. We also asked them about the decisions on their husbands and partners' earning. To each of these questions, women could report that they were the sole decision makers in these decisions, that their partner was the sole decision maker, that they made the decisions together, or that someone else outside the household made these decisions. This is very similar to the questions that are implemented in the DHS. Each of these responses, we coded them in binary form, in which we said that women were empowered if she was the sole decision maker or if she made the decisions with their partner, and she was not empowered if the partner was the sole decision maker or if someone else. We also tested different combinations on how to code this variable and did a sensitivity analysis, which we presented in a paper that presents the results of this analysis, and you will be able to see the reference in the last slide of this presentation. And we did not find any differences in our results in terms of the interpretation. Now, the second domain that we intended to capture with our metric is financial autonomy. To measure financial autonomy, we included 5 questions. The first one asked women if they currently have any savings for the future. The second one, if they know where to go for financial information or advice. The third one, if they have financial goals. The fourth one, if they have a mobile money account. And the fifth one, if they know how to manage their money and financial matters. All of these responses, we again coded them into a binary form in which 1 equals that it was a positive response and 0, it was not. As you can see in this table, we have some of the items that are presented in a different shade of blue, in a lighter blue. And those are the items that we did not retain for our final scale when we started the exploratory analysis of our scale. I'm not going to present those results because of time, but those are available in the paper. Next one, please, Caroline. Now, I'm going to start by presenting some of the results of the analysis. And what you're seeing in this table is the pattern matrix that resulted from the confirmatory factor analysis. The way that you interpret this table is that each row represents a survey question. As you can see, it says large purchases, daily purchases, and etc. And then each column within a country represents a factor or an underlying construct that is revealed by the analysis. And just to mention that the analysis was done separately for each country. So that's why each column within a country represents the underlying construct. The way that we interpret the numbers in this table is that if a variable shows a high number, which we call loading, in one of the columns, then it means that that variable corresponds to that column only or factor. So if a variable is loading high on only one factor, then that's a good thing because it means that it corresponds only to that factor. Now, if it loads on more than one, then it is ambiguous, and that's something that we would not want to have. What I wanted you to take as a key takeaway from this table is that we can clearly see that there is a pattern that is shown in this table that shows that the questions related to household decision making are loading on the first column only, and the questions related to financial autonomy are loading on the second column only across all of the sites in which we did this analysis. And also we see that this pattern is consistent across the settings, and this is providing us evidence that we have a cross-cultural construct validity and that there is a dual dimensionality of our women's economic empowerment scale. Now, in the next slide, at the bottom of this table, we're also presenting the coefficient of internal consistency, which my colleague Celia already described. And the key takeaway from this, from the numbers that are shown in this row, is that you can see that for household decision making, all of our internal reliability coefficients are above 0.6, meaning that we do have a good internal reliability on their household decision-making scale. Now, that is not the case for financial autonomy, and we need to continue working more on that one. So, next one. Now that I've presented the construct validity and internal consistency of our metric, we can turn into the descriptive results. For each domain, we calculated a scale score. And the way that we calculated this score is by adding up or summing up the items within each of the domains, be given that all of the variables that we used were constructed in a binary form. As a result, the household decision-making scale ranges from 0 to 4, as you can see in this figure, while the financial autonomy scale ranges from 0 to 3. Now, in this bar graph that you're seeing here, this is showing the distribution of women who, at the time of the survey, were in union based on the number of household decisions in which they participated. A score of 0 means that that woman that does not participate in any of the forced household decisions, meaning the purchase of large items, daily necessities, medical care, or clothing for herself. And a score of 0 indicates that she participated in all of those 4 decisions. Clearly, what you can see in this figure here is that we found that there are large differences across settings. So, for example, in Niger, we can see that 67% of the women interviewed in 2019 indicated that they did not participate in any of the 4 household decision-making decisions. While on the contrary, we can see that in Kenya in 2020, 61% of the women reported that they participated of all 4 decision of all 4 decision-making items. Now we can go into looking at the results of for financial autonomy. Thank you, Caroline. And the interpretation of this graph is similar to the previous one. In this figure, you're seeing the distribution of in-union women according to the number of financial autonomy traits that they reported having, specifically if they had savings for the future, if they know where to access financial information, and if they had financial goals. A score of 0 indicates that a woman has none of the traits, while a score of 3 means that she has all of those 3 reported traits. Now, once again here, you can see that we observe differences across settings, though the differences are not as stark as those that we observe in household decision making. So for example, here you can see that in Niger in 2019, 59% of women reported having no savings, no financial goals, and no knowledge of where to obtain financial information. In contrast, you can see that in Lagos, 43% of women reported having all of the 3 financial autonomy traits. Next one, please. Now to wrap up, I just want to spend a few minutes sharing some of the key takeaways of our work. One of the key takeaways is that we saw that for both household decision-making and financial autonomy, we saw that the levels of empowerment vary across settings. And as an example, we saw that the level of household decision-making ranged from 67% of women reporting no participation in Niger in 2019 to 2% in Lagos in 2020. Moreover, our main contribution with this analysis is that we were able to validate our household decision-making scale, and we found that it has cross-country validity. Another key contribution is that we're proposing a scale that is composed of only 4 survey questions, and adding these survey questions into any household level survey it's not taking much room out of a long questionnaire. As I shown in my first slide, some of the women's economic empowerment tools are to be constructed by asking 81 questions to women. So with this tool, we're proposing that we can improve the efficiency of surveys, given that we know that adding questions to an already extensive questionnaire has a serious cost, given the fatigue and impatience that can alter the accuracy of the responses. So in a way, with our 4 survey question scale, we are aiming to improve the efficiency of surveys. And now I'm going to pass it back to Caroline for some closing remarks, and thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Celia. Just as we wrap up, we have a list of current publications that summarize some of the work or expand on the work that we have presented, both from the qualitative perspectives that Liz presented to the validation of the sexual and reproductive health scale index, and also Carolina's work on measuring economic empowerment. So you can find some of the details that we skipped because of time constraints in these publications. We also have ongoing research that will be published in the coming months. As we kind of wrap up this session, I think we have a few minutes for burning questions if anyone wants to post in the chat or pose questions. I've been answering a few questions in the Q&A, and I think some of your concerns relate to kind of the multidimensionality of empowerment. We showed you 2 dimensions, but I think as kind of one of the takeaways of this work is that we generally talk about empowerment as a construct. We should talk about the plurality of empowerment, as people might be empowered in the economic sphere, but less so in the sexual and reproductive sphere, and vice versa. I think that has implications both for measurement, but importantly for programs, as we want to make sure that the indicators that we use align well with the theory of change. If we need to align our measures and the empowerment measures with the spheres of life that we want to have an impact on. So I think that's a really important takeaway message, not to necessarily assume that economic empowerment goes hand in hand with all aspects of women's empowerment. In the next session, stay tuned and come back, I hope, next week. We will be talking about and taking these concepts that we presented today and think a little bit about some of the questions you also posted around who's empowered and how it varies across socioeconomic status and so on. So we will be joined by Linnea Zimmerman, Carolina, and Shannon Wood, who will share some insights on some of the drivers of economic or SRH empowerment. And importantly, why does empowerment matter in the sphere of sexual and reproductive health, especially when we think about the translation of these concepts into health services? And we'll look at kind of the connection between and the predictive effect of empowerment on contraceptive use by choice, as well as the contribution of contraceptive use, on the other hand, on women's economic empowerment, because this connection is bidirectional. So with that, I hope that you will join us next week. This is being recorded. We will post it on our website and share it widely. I have seen some people hoping that we will have a French translation. As a Francophone myself, absolutely, we will try to make that effort in the sessions to come. This is our first launch of webinar series around the work, the research that we are conducting at the Gates Institute. And so we will improve our process over time. Thank you all for participating, and stay tuned, and we hope to see you again next week.